Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Lost Season 6 Part 3. This video is part of a series of videos where I review every episode of Lost in parts. And so in this part I will be covering episodes 15 through 17 of Lost. These are the final 3 episodes of the entire show. So I have to start with a spoiler warning for Lost up to the very end of the entire show. If you haven't seen all of Lost all the way to the end of the very last episode, you will not want to watch this video, otherwise some things will be spoiled for you. Now, typically with these videos I'll have a spoiler-free section and a spoiler section, but because this video will go all the way to the end of the show, I will not be doing that. My spoilers will be mixed in with my regular review, because I am assuming if you're watching this video that you have seen all the way to the end of Lost. So that means you shouldn't be watching this video unless you've seen the finale, because you can't be like, oh, I've seen Across the Sea, so I'll just watch the section on Across the Sea or whatever, because I'll be sprinkling spoilers throughout the entire video, because I'm not going to, even the earlier episodes, so I'm not going to bother with a spoiler section. So, Season 6 of Lost. Now, if you know, I've talked about this before in my previous 2 videos on Season 6, that this is definitely the worst season of Lost. It was definitely a very disappointing way to end the show, and I think in particular for these last set of episodes that it is quite disappointing, and I would say this is probably one of the most disappointing seasons of television of all time, because Lost was so great in its heyday. I would argue, up until the first 4 seasons were amazing. The first half of season 5 was amazing. The second half of season 5 was take it or leave it, but season 6 not good at all. And I think it's a really disappointing season. Now, do I think that the finale is the worst finale of all time? Because it's actually a very common phrase that a lot of people are saying, that they think that the final episode of Lost was one of the worst final episodes of all time. I actually don't agree with that. And a lot of people, when the final episode of Game of Thrones came out, a lot of people were asking me, they were comparing them, like, oh, Mark, which one do you think is worse? And at the time, I said Game of Thrones, and after watching the final episode of Lost, I stand behind that stance even more firmly. That it's definitely Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones finale is one of the worst. It's worse than Dexter. A lot of people are like, oh, these fanboys are so spoiled because they don't know what it's like to have the finale, a terrible finale like Dexter. Dexter is actually not as bad as Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones is worse. I'm sorry, but it is. And it's worse than Lost. And I'll get into that later, because the final episode itself, which of course I'll cover a bit later, is not a... I would actually give it a middling rating for an episode itself. Now, it has, for a final episode of the show, it does, especially this show, which set up so many mysteries, it does fall short. But I would say overall, Lost has a disappointing season rather than a disappointing final season rather than a disappointing final episode. I think the fault is definitely with the entire season dropping the ball. The final episode is actually, I would say, one of the better episodes of the season. But here's the thing. I give all of my episodes a rating between 1 and 10. And with Season 6 of Lost, every episode that features a flash sideways gets a negative rating. So 5 at the highest. So every episode with the flash sideways in it gets a 1 through 5. So that means only 2 episodes get a positive rating, because only 2 episodes do not feature the flash sideways, and I stand behind that. Now, I will give the final episode a 5, so it gets the highest out of these low ratings, but it's still still a low rating. But anyway, speaking of that episode that does not have flash sideways, let me go ahead, start this video, get into the episode, start with the first episode of the video, episode number 15, Across the Sea. Now, this as I said, I'm giving this a positive rating, which a lot of people would be up in arms about. In fact, I mentioned this in a previous video I did, that I actually really liked this episode, and I don't understand why I get so much hate. And I got a few comments like, well, how can you like this episode? It's terrible. And watching it again, I disagree. I don't think it's terrible. In fact, I will go and say that this is the second best episode of Season 6, because it's one of only two that don't feature Flash Sideways. And I think the Flash Sideways are much worse. I'm glad I didn't have to put up with any of the Flash Sideways bullshit in this episode. Now, so that automatically makes it better in my mind. But here's the thing. This is a very polarizing episode. And even when it first came out, people were really split on this episode. And I would say people are still split, because a lot of people will try to present it as it's the overwhelming majority opinion that this episode is terrible. Like, I watched this podcast once where there was 3 podcasters, and they were it's kind of where I borrowed this sort of method from, where they would take all episodes of Lost and they would take turns naming their least favorites until they went down the list and created their collective list. And one person who went first with the worst episode named this the worst episode. So on their collective list, this was named the worst episode of the show. And that person in particular liked Season 6 and liked The Flash Sideways, liked the ending, but hated this episode. And I think there's a common opinion. Well, but I couldn't disagree with that opinion more. I'm almost on the exact opposite spectrum of that. Now, the thing is, I looked this up on IMDb, and it has an average rating of 8.2, and it's actually not that bad. It puts it kind of in the middle of the ratings all the episodes they have rated on IMDb. And interesting to note, the final episode, the end, has an 8.1. So this episode actually scores a bit higher than the final episode. Now, part of that may be due to the fact that the final episode probably has a lot more casual watchers who give the episode a 1, because there's a lot of people who normally wouldn't vote on IMDb, who normally wouldn't vote on all episodes of Lost, who particularly came to voice their how upset they were with the finale. So that probably skewed the results. It's kind of like in the Deep Space Nine on IMDb. Trials and Tribulations is the highest rated episode, because so many people who don't normally watch Deep Space Nine or don't normally vote on Deep Space Nine came to just vote on that one episode because it's the one Kirk appears in. This is kind of that, but with a negative spin instead of a positive spin, that a lot of people who normally wouldn't vote come and vote because that finale sucked. So I do admit that probably skewed the results a bit, but it's still interesting to note that this episode's actually rated higher. And that actually surprised me, because the feedback I hear from, as I said, on my own webpage and other videos I've seen, like there's this one video I watched recently that they do a series of all these TV shows of when it died, like when was the death knell of the show, and that video concluded it was this episode. Across the Sea. I just really disagree with that. I still think, this has a positive rating, and so I think that I'm not alone. I think there's other people out there who do agree with me. This episode's not that bad. I wouldn't say it's one of the best episodes of the show, but I would ultimately say it's a good episode. Now, so this, of course, is the episode that entirely takes place in the past. It tells the story of Jacob and the Man in Black, and it introduces the mother, and it sort of introduces ideas like the light, which, of course, will play a huge factor in the finale, and, of course, explains how the Man in Black became the smoke monster. And stuff like that. And, of course, it also explains the frozen donkey wheel, and what's that about, and stuff like that. Now, a lot of people think this episode's really cheesy, and I disagree. And I've read some positive reviews, And I agree with the word they use to describe this episode, and that's mythical. It does come off as a classic myth or a classic fairy tale. Now, here's the thing. I did not like the ending of Lost, particularly because of the focus of this Flash sideways. And there was a lot of hanging story threads that the showrunners decided to just ignore. Which pissed me off. A lot of people phrase that wrong. I think they phrased it, there were questions they didn't answer or mysteries that they didn't solve. But I think the proper way to phrase it is there's story threads that they ignored and never resolved, that went unresolved. I think that's the proper way to put it, but all meaning the same thing, really. Because, and I'll get more into this when I cover the finale, but it's not about answering questions. It's not about a monkey coming out and reading out the answers to all the questions. It's about setting up a storyline or a story thread and resolving it in a satisfying way. Something, by the way, which the first 4 seasons of the show, particularly the first 2, was really good at. But all of a sudden, in season 5 and 6, they no longer did that anymore. They no longer cared to do that. But anyway, so yeah, this episode Across the Sea, it's a lot. The most common complaint that I've heard about this episode is that it was placed wrong. Like, some people even went far to say that if this was earlier in the season, if this was like episode 4 or 5, then it would actually be good, or they wouldn't really have an issue with it. But because it was the third to last episode of the show, that was the absolute wrong place to put it, and it upset them, and they made them hate this episode more because it interfered with the ending. Because we're running towards the end, we're focusing on the characters of Jack, Kate, and Knotlock and Sawyer and Hurley and all of them. We're invested on them, and all of a sudden that story comes to a complete halt. To have this episode to take place entirely in the past, entirely about Jacob, and it's just wrong, and it just interferes with that story. Now, at the time this episode came out, the Damon Lindelof and Carlton Cuse said that they disagreed, and I think they even said this on the commentary on the DVD, that they thought that this episode had to be placed here, that this was the perfect place for it, that it wouldn't work earlier in the season. And I can kind of see their argument, because this is setting up the light. It's setting up how Jacob was forced to become the protector of Ryan. Like his mother specifically said, you do not have a choice. And this comes to play in the very next episode, where Jacob takes Jack, Kate, Hurley, and Sawyer, sits them down and says, I am giving you a choice because I never had one. So a lot of what happens in this episode does feature heavily in the next 2 episodes. So if they had this episode at like episode 4 or 5, then it wouldn't play as well. It would kind of be old hat. But then again, I do get the argument that because the episode before this ended with Sun and Jen dying and Saeed being killed in the submarine, and they were like in dire straits and they're crying, so it's a huge cliffhanger, and Locke says, I'm going to, what did he say? I'm gonna finish the job. That's what he said to Claire. Now it's a big cliffhanger, so everyone's like, on edge of a huge emotional ending. And then the next week, they have to wait a week, and then it gets this episode that has absolutely nothing to do with it. It doesn't continue that story in any way, shape, or form. It's just a complete aside that takes place thousands of years ago, or hundreds of years ago, whatever the case may be. And so I can understand a lot of people being like, what the fuck? Now, for me personally, and this is something my brother's probably sick of hearing me talk about, but I'm sorry, I feel so strongly about this. I did not feel this way about Lost, but I felt this way about another show, and it seems like I'm in the complete minority about this, but another show which Damon Lindelof was also the showrunner for, The Leftovers. In their first season, they had this, it was a 10-episode season. In episode 8, they had this huge cliffhanger where, a main character died, things were in dire straits, and you were wondering what the hell is going to happen. And then episode 9 was a complete flashback episode that took place 3 years ago. And so it didn't continue the story of that with the cliffhanger that was left off in episode 8 at 9 at all. And so we had to wait another week until episode 10 to actually get the conclusion of that cliffhanger they left in episode 8. That I will stand by to my dying day. I will stand on this hill. I will stand firmly with all conviction and say that episode was poorly placed. That episode should have been episode 8, and the cliffhanger should have been in episode 9, because interrupting that cliffhanger was a huge mistake. And the funny thing is when I was watching this show, I was not watching it as it aired. I was binging it. So I didn't even have to wait 2 weeks. I could just flip to the next episode. But the thing is during that episode 9, which a lot of people loved for some reason, I just thought it was mediocre, to be honest, because it was like, oh, look at these characters are doing different things. They looked so different 3 years ago. But it seemed like a gimmick that I've seen in several other shows, like Heroes and Prison Break. They've always done this gimmick, so it was nothing new, and I kind of expected it to be this way. I'm like, really? We're going to have to halt this cliffhanger to deal with this gimmick? Which to be fair, I didn't hate that episode. I thought it was decent, but I didn't think it was. Some people thought it was the best episode of the season, which I think you're totally wrong about that. But anyway, regardless of that, I wouldn't have minded that episode as much if it was episode 8, and then they had the cliffhanger be episode 9, and then they go straight into the finale. I would have actually appreciated that episode a lot more. In fact, as I was watching that episode on the bench, I was so tempted to just skip it. I was so tempted to be like, what the fuck is it? I want to find out what happens in cliffhanger, skip to the next episode. But I didn't do that, just in case there was some important information in that episode I needed to have for the finale, and there was. But that important information would have still been just as important if it was episode 8. Anyway, I firmly stand behind that. Now, the Lost thing, I'm actually not as bothered. I'm definitely not as the Leftovers situation. I'm perfectly fine with them having this Across the Sea being 2 episodes before the finale. Maybe if this was the penultimate episode, such as the case of the Leftovers, then maybe I could see the argument being made that that's the wrong time to do it, because they definitely should have had What They Died For be the penultimate episode. But, I mean, maybe this episode could have been episode 14, so they wouldn't interrupt the cliffhanger with Son of Jin dying. I wouldn't mind that, but I honestly don't think it's absolutely required. But I do agree with the argument the producers made that you couldn't have this episode earlier in the season. It needed to be in the later half. Now, whether or not it needed to be exactly where it was, I think there's some wiggle room for that. But it definitely needed to be in the second half, or the latter half of the season. That much is for sure. Now, as for the episode itself, I remember when I first watched this episode, I was living in New Zealand at the time, and I was watching it on iTunes, I believe. And my brother was living in America, so he got to see it first. And he sent me an email saying, what a massive disappointment. I was so disappointed by it. And because the thing is that me and him were talking a lot about Lost, and we knew that this episode was coming. And maybe that's another reason why I wasn't as bothered by this break, because I knew from months ago, because we follow the spoilers and message boards and whatnot, I knew for a long time that episode 15 would be a Jacob episode taking place entirely in the past. And as a matter of fact, we were looking forward to this episode the most. This is the one we were really looking forward to. This is going to be the mythology-heavy episode that's going to get into the nitty-gritty of Jacob, that's going to explain everything. It's going to be so amazing. And I talked in the previous episode how all these episodes watching that I hated, like Everybody Loves Hugo and The Last Recruit, which are horrible episodes. And I was thinking I was giving up on the show, and it's when I realized Season 6 was going to suck. But I had one glimmer of hope, and that glimmer was this episode coming up, the Jacob episode. I was thinking, okay, these Flesh Sandwiches is bullshit, but there's a Jacob episode coming up. So that could save the season. That could be amazing. And so our expectations were high. So I think I can understand why my brother was so disappointed. And to be clear, if I don't want to speak for him, but as my understanding, he actually came to appreciate that episode a bit more later on. It was just an initial shock of disappointment. So but having that email actually helped me because it helped me rein in my expectations before I watched the episode. So I knew, okay, there's a possibility this episode might suck. And I watched it, and I was like, that didn't suck. I mean, it wasn't the masterpiece I was hoping it would be, as certainly not enough to save this season, but it didn't suck. It was fine. Because it certainly wasn't the mythology heavy. Here are all the answers you loved, you wanted, and here are all the satisfying resolutions to all these storylines that we're gonna not just leave dangling. It wasn't that, so they did leave all the storylines dangling, but we did get some really strong answers, such as the how Man in Black became the smoke monster, what's the deal with the frozen donkey wheel, and there's also like little subtle tie-ins that I really loved about this episode. And so, even though it wasn't definitely wasn't the masterpiece I was hoping it would be, it was still a decent episode. I still think I like it much better than all the other episodes except for one, Abbott Turner, of course, of season 6. I did think it was a strong character story. I like the aspect of the fact that because throughout the season they presented Jacob and the Man in Black as good versus evil, but here we see that Jacob's not so good. And I see some people had an issue with that, but I actually find that a strength of the episode. That you see Jacob like beating the shit out of his brother. You see the fact that Jacob let the anger of the fact that his brother killed their mother take control of him and like punish him and throw him down the well, which is what turned him into the smoke monster. I like that. I think that's really amazing. Now, other people had an issue with this episode because they thought it was too hokey, and frankly, they thought it was too fantasy-like, that they were hoping for more scientific explanation on things like the smoke monster and the frozen donkey wheel. I've heard some opinion that the whole concept of the frozen donkey wheel is retarded and stupid and cheesy and dumb. But again, I look at it as a myth. As it's a mythical, and I actually don't mind the fantastical aspects of Lost because they were always there. From the very first pilot episode, they were just more in the background. They were more implied. They were more hidden. Where now, when you get to the final season, you have to, once you delve deeper into those, it's obviously going to be more in your face, flat out fantasy. But I think anyone who was paying attention should have seen that coming. I'm not saying they would have if you're paying attention because you're not a real fan. I'm not going to say bullshit like that. But just my opinion that you should have. Because I think the writing was on the wall all along. There were some people who were expecting, and I'll get more into this when I cover the finale, there were some people who were expecting more flat-out scientific explanations. And I have read a lot of theories throughout the show's run that was very scientific based, like here's the scientific reason for that, it's based off of this scientific theory and blah blah blah. But I always knew from the tone of the show that wouldn't be the case, that the explanation would be a lot more mythical and a lot more fantasy driven, and that turned out to be the case, and I wasn't the least bit surprised nor disappointed. Perfectly fine. I mean, some people thought it was cheesy that Jacob threw the Man in Black down into the light and then be turned into a smoke monster. But like the whole concept of the smoke monster is fantasy based. Like would you expect like a mad scientist to come in and do some scientific explanation or experiment on exactly why a smoke monster came into existence? That would be dumb in my opinion. I would much rather have a fantastical explanation as the one we got. Now, and even with like the frozen donkey wheel, as I said, that some people were very much against the entire concept. I'm not. I would never was. I was on board with it. I just went with it, suspension of disbelief. And in this case, they didn't violate their own fantasy rules. As I said, any fantasy has to develop their own rules. Doesn't matter how crazy they are, as long as they establish the rules and stick to them. And in this episode, they did. So I didn't have an issue with it. How they explained the first in Donkey Will, that the Man in Black just somehow intuitively knew that that the light was underneath, and that if he connected the light to the thing, it would allow him to leave the island. Now, a lot of people go, how the fuck would he know that? But it's a fantasy, you had to go with it, that he has some sort of spiritual connection to the island, or intuitive mind who can just know or intuit these things, and I'm fine to go with that. That's fine with me. I have no issue with that. Now, as far as the light itself, and I'll probably get more into this in the finale, a lot of people complain about this because it seems to come out of nowhere. Came out of absolute nowhere. Like, we're all the way in the third to last episode of the entire show. We've been 6 seasons to this entire show, and all of a sudden, they're going to tell me there's this magical light that if it goes out, the world's going to end, and that's what the whole show is about. And you wait until the third to last episode to reveal this. And I disagree with that. I think that is absolutely incorrect as well, because they have been implying, they've been subtly dropping hints about this ever since the first season. Because in the very first season, Sayid had this thing where he said that, he had the compass, all the compasses were broken, and they were all pointing the wrong way. How could this be? There must be some enormous, ridiculously enormously large electromagnetism throwing it off. And then, of course, it's explored more in Season 2 when you get the hatch and you find out that is a huge electromagnetism, and you see this huge electromagnetic weird purple sky event where the whole island goes and at the end of Season 2, and then that's touched on more and more in later seasons. So this is the source of that electromagnetism, and that electromagnetism is so focused, and this is the heart of it, that it's basically the heart of the world, and without it, the whole world will slip into darkness. Now, granted, that aspect of it is not really scientific at all. It's very, very fantasy-based, but I'm okay with fantasy-based. As I said, it doesn't break any of the rules of this fantasy that they established. In fact, as I said, it didn't come out of nowhere. It was hinted at all along. This is just taking it to the proper conclusion. Like, it was even hinted at earlier this season. It's hinted at from the very beginning that the island is special. And so this, we find out specifically why. Now, I did bring this up in my Season 1 videos, and someone pointed out in the comments, and I think I've seen a few other places on the net, that the producers did say, they did confirm that when they made that mention in Season 1 of Sayid finding the compasses didn't work, that they kind of just made that up on the spot. That they almost didn't even, they just put it in because they didn't have enough fill time in the episode. They put it in as filler, basically. So they say that to contradict me, that they planned for this all along. But I'm not saying that they planned for this all along. I think it's very obvious that they didn't know what the fuck they were doing in Season 1. I mean, I'm never going to say they planned for this all along. What I'm saying is they hinted at this all along. So as they were developing the show running on, I think eventually they shaped it to become this. And I will grant you that it's very likely that they didn't come up with this specific idea for this specific light being the heart of the island, being if it goes out, the world's destroyed, that they didn't come up with this idea until Season 6. I'm all on board with that. But it fits so perfectly with what they had already established. They built naturally off of what they had been hinting at ever since Season 1. So I'm not saying they came up with the light in Season 1. I'm saying that they came up with electromagnetism being important to the island. They hinted at it in Season 1, but they really started to drive it home in Season 2. That's when they came up with it. And eventually, so it's this thread they had the whole time about this massive amount of electromagnetism. They just shaped it into this light when Season 6 came along, and I think that's perfect. And that's the thing that I'll get into, because a lot of people who hate the ending, they hate the mythical side of it, or the explanation, or the answers we did get. I have no issue. I actually like all the answers that we did get. I'm just upset about all the ones we didn't get, or resolution to storylines, I should say, not answers. I already established that. Anyway, so I don't have an issue with the light. Now, as for this episode specifically, some people thought just the characters were cheesy. They thought the dialogue was cheesy. They thought the whole thing with the mother and how she, just killed the... I don't know what their arguments are, because I disagree. I totally disagree. I think I saw one review, they're like, oh, this is so cheesy. She wouldn't act this way. Oh, we're supposed to believe this person came. Oh, that's so dumb. I just don't see that point of view. I think the Flash Sideways are like 1 billion times worse. Again, they're way more cheesy, in my opinion. I have no issue. And in fact, I love the lore of that. I think it's amazing to see this time period, like with the Roman times, and that it dates back to all this. Now, I would have liked more resolution on things like what the Egyptian statue and some of the ancient Egyptian writings that seem to be around the island, and we got no resolution to that whatsoever, which I am a bit disappointed about, but I'm not totally upset about that. I don't think the show would have been better for it if they would have answered it, but I don't think that it invalidates the show that they didn't. Let me put it that way, because it's ultimately, and I'm really of the mind that the writers or the showrunners or producers didn't really know what they were. They just put it in there because they wanted to establish that the island has been around, is ancient. And so the easiest way to establish have ancient writings and ancient statues to imply it's ancient. And I think that's as far as they thought through. And that's as far as that you really need to know that's actually important for the story, if I'm being honest. So ultimately, I don't have an issue with any of that. Now, the one continuity error is, so in season 1, and I talked about this in my season 1 review, when they found the caves, they found these 2 skeletons, and Locke called them Adam and Eve, and apparently, what's his face? Damon Lindelof was saying that this will be answered. In fact, throughout the 6 seasons runs, he was saying this: once we answer this question, it's going to prove that we had everything planned out all along. Like this is gonna be our masterpiece. That's gonna prove that we weren't just making shit as we went. But it does nothing of the sort. It actually creates a continuity error and kind of proves the opposite, that they weren't making shit up, because in that scene, Jack dates their clothing as being 50 years old. And here, we see these skeletons are actually centuries old. Now, a lot of people have come up with excuses to try to, flimsy excuses to try to excuse this, like they used magic in their, to wove their clothing or stuff that made it not disintegrate. So it appeared to Jack that they were 50 years old. Some people would say, oh, he's a doctor. What the fuck does he know about clothing? But, no, it's an error. No excuses aside, it really makes me think that that's not what they were planning, that they were not planning for these bodies to be centuries old, that that's something they made up. I think it's plausible that they could have just had some very vague idea that the skeletons would belong to the original protectors of the island, although that's maybe giving the writers a bit too much credit. But it's possible. I'm not ruling that possibility out. But they definitely didn't know specifically for this, so that's actually bullshit. And plus, I did find the ending a bit cheesy, how they played clips from that episode from the first season. They played it in and intermingled with the Jacob, putting his dead mother and dead brother bodies there, because to make it clear, just in case you weren't paying attention, hey, let's make it clear that these are the skeletons we found. But I guess, like, casual viewer wouldn't remember that far back, so I suppose it was necessary. But really, usually they don't. They're not this heavy-handed. Usually they just hint at it and they rely on you to fill in the blanks. But I guess they just really wanted to make it clear. Anyway, the other thing is about the light, and this is something I love, and this is also something you have to. This situation where you fill in the blanks, that when Mother's talking, explaining light to Jacob and Man in Black, she says that that men would try to use it for their own purposes, and in doing so, they could put it out, which would destroy the world. And then later, the Man in Black says with his Roman friends, he's like, "Oh, we have some ideas on what to do with it," and she's like, "You can't do anything with it." And this is, to me, perfectly foreshadows and explains the Dharma Initiative. That they found out about this mass is one of the main reasons why they came to the island to study it, because they found about its unique properties, particularly the massive amounts of electromagnetism. And they even hinted at earlier in the season that Jin was sent, when he was in the Dharma Initiative, he was sent to map all the places of electromagnetism. They were looking specifically for high concentrations, which is why they built a swan where they did, because they found a really high because that was a location of a really high concentration of electromagnetism. Now, they couldn't find the actual heart of the island, no doubt because Jacob was hiding it from them. So where the swan site was actually somewhat near it, so there was obviously a high concentration there as well. And because what Mother said is that men would try to use it, and in doing so might put it out, is exactly what happened with the incident. That they tried to tap into this electromagnetism, and by doing so, and they were doing it by going underground, the same thing that the Man in Black did, and by doing so, they nearly destroyed it, which is why the whole thing with the button, that if we fail to push the button, it would be the end of the world. It absolutely would be the end of the world, because they would be putting out the light, which is the heart of the world, and without it, it would be the end of the world. So it ties into this. You just have to use your noggin a bit to fill in the blanks. I don't think there are some cases where fanboys will come up with their own theories to try to make up for the lack of storytelling or the lack of answers, the lack of resolutions, that the writers clearly didn't know what the fuck they were talking about. But I really don't think this is the case, because there are also other cases where it is so strongly implied that this is clearly what they were talking about. And I think this is that case. I don't think I'm being fanboyish here or making up my own theories. I think it's very clear to anyone who's paying strong attention that that's what they're implying with that line with Mother. I think that's clear as day. She might as well just said the Dharma Initiative when she said, "Oh, men will come and use it for their own purposes." It's very clear that they purposely put that line in there to explain exactly what the deal with the Dharma Initiative and the incident was, which I love, by the way. I think that's great. I think it really ties in. It's not so. Even though this episode wasn't the bastion of answers and mythology that I was hoping it would be, it's still very strong. And on top of that, it's a very strong character story. I think this, as I said, the way it flips the relationship with Man in Black and Jacob on his head and gives you more needed backstory and just tells you how fucked up their mother was, but really it was her job to protect the island. Like, that's interesting stuff. In retrospect, I think maybe they could have done this in the standard flashback format rather than just having an entire episode about it. They could have done what they died for storyline and just had, because Jacob pops up every once in a while, and just have a Jacob flashbacks, and they could trim this down a bit. I don't think this story would be hurt from trimming the fat, because there's a lot of fat and boring scenes in this, so they could trim it down to its bare bones and have it as a flashback that's cut in between the events on the island of what they died for, and I think maybe that would have worked better. Maybe people would have complained a lot less because they wouldn't have to go an entire episode without seeing the characters they're familiar with. That's just me. But as is, I think this is a good episode. I do. I think this is, as I said, it's not, I wouldn't say it's one of the best of the show, but it's definitely really good. My opinion. Anyway, now we gotta get back to the Flash Sideways. So now I'm not going to be so positive. So let's get to the next episode, which is What They Died For. And I really don't like this episode. I mean, the one thing I would say is a positive is the Jacob scenes. And it's funny because I've seen other reviews that hated these Jacob scenes because they thought it was too much like spewing exposition. Because here's the thing, Damon Lindelof often talked about how he hated the architect scene from The Matrix Reloaded, saying it was one of the worst scenes ever, and he wouldn't, because it's basically someone just sitting down spouting out exposition and explaining the story to the audience. And so he said he would never do that. But other people argued that this is exactly what he did do in this episode, with Jacob sitting down by the fire and explaining the story to Jack, Kate, and everyone else. But I would counter that with a couple of things. First of all, I love the architect scene from The Matrix Reloaded. Call me stupid. I know people love to shit on that scene. I love that scene. I think that's really trippy, the way they do with all the TVs, and the way he talks is really weird, and I think it like lays it out to you, but not in a way that's kind of confusing, so it doesn't give you all the information, but it's really interesting. I love that architect scene. So by having Lost do something similar, I don't mind. I like this Jacob fireplace scene. I think this was pretty good as well. I think he laid it out like pretty much out there, like what the thing I brought you guys had a troubled life. I didn't pluck you from any lives you had. You didn't have anyone your lives were troubled to begin with, even before I brought you to the island. And that's why I chose you. I chose you because you're broken. And so I brought you here to heal. And that's kind of the theme getting into the final episode, which is the theme of the Flash Sideways, is that the time that the A-15 survivors spent on the island was the best time of their lives, and it was the island overall is a place of healing, has a healed Locke, it healed Rose, and it's a really beautiful, special place that needs to be protected. This is undermined by the fact that everyone fucking dies on this island. Like 200 or so people died when Jacob brought the A-15 plane here. And then most of those people who survived just got killed by fire arrows. Nobody gave a shit. And then most of the others just got killed off by the fucking smoke monster. And all the people who came on the Azura flight, they all got killed. Nobody even fucking knows why. And so all the other characters, Charlotte, Charlie, like so many main characters as well, just die off like flies, to the point where there's only like 8 people left out of like when there were hundreds before. So it's a death trap. It's a place of horrors. This place is death, as they might say. And so like really undermines the argument they try to make here about the island being special. Just to plug my own fan fiction version of the show, where I do how I would write Lost, I correct this by not making it a place of death. And so the island actually is special, and they can say this and it has some validity. But that's just me. Anyway, other thing, the huge issue I have with this scene, in fact, it pisses me off, and I was even thinking about this one line that's in this episode. I was thinking while I was watching all of season 6, I kept thinking about this line. It fucking drives me insane. It drives me up the fucking walls. I think is one of the worst things the writers ever did, is because throughout this season it was clear that Kate is not a candidate. They made a point to show it in the cave. Her name was scratched off, and then earlier, and the candidate, Widmore, threatens to kill Kate, And he says, well, she's not a candidate, so I don't care. And Sawyer's like, yeah, he's right. He's going to kill you because he doesn't care. You're not a candidate. In this episode, Jacob sits down with Hurley, Sawyer, and Jack, who all are candidates. They're established. They have their name in the cave. And Kate. And he says that any one of you can be the candidate. And she asks, well, how come I'm not a candidate? And he says, well, it's because you became a mother. But here's the one line that I think is one of the worst lines of the show. It just angers me. I can't say it without all this resentment and anger. What Jacob says to her next is just chalk in a cave. The job is yours if you want it. What? What the fuck do you mean it's just called chalk in a cave? There's all these rules based on who the candidates are. The Man in Black is not allowed to kill candidates. He can kill anyone else, but he can't kill candidates. And they have these special powers that can take over Jacob. It's not just fucking chalk. This is fantasy breaking the rules. See, this is Lost breaking its own rules because it establishes fantasy rules that the cave, those names and those chalk in the cave was signifying, and it gave magical, fantastical abilities to those who were named in the cave, and it meant something. And now all of a sudden, oh, it's just called chalk in a cave. Fuck you! You're breaking your rules. It's bullshit. What's the whole point of not having... And this really makes me think that the writers didn't know what the fuck they were doing when they did this earlier. Why even bother with the storyline of Kate not being a candidate? And why the fuck would Jacob not, like, scratch her name off just because she became a mother? Claire's name was on there, and she was pregnant when she first came to the fucking island. None of this makes any goddamn sense. Ugh, fuck. I'm so pissed off. Anyway, hate that. But the rest of the Jacob scene, especially when Jack became the new Jacob, I really love the line. And again, I talked about this in my earlier videos about how Jack's character story is my favorite part of season 6. I really love the line when he says, this is what I'm meant to do. I'm supposed to do this. And Jacob says, is that a question, Jack? And he says, no, it's not. And Jacob says, good. That was great. I did love that scene, and I did love the fact that Jack became the new Jacob, even after what Knotlock says in the next episode of that's kind of the obvious choice, which was a bit of a meta statement, but I think it's the logical choice. I think it really, and because, as I said, Jack was in this character journey throughout the last 2 seasons and I think this is a great journey. I disagree with some people who thought it ruined his character, because I think this was a great character journey for Jack, who is very anti the island. I just want to leave it. It's just a place I need to leave. But he has this experience of leaving, and then his life is even worse. His life is ruined. He realizes it's like that movie, that book, Lost Horizon, which the writer said didn't influence him at all, which I think is bullshit. I think it's very clearly that book did influence him. And that once he's gone from paradise, he realizes he never should have left. And then he becomes just as faith-driven as Locke used to be. He becomes the new Locke. And I love that. I absolutely love that. So I think that works. But the rest of the episode I have a huge issue with. So it's basically only that Jacob fire scene, but even that has that thing about the chalk, which pissed me the hell off, so even that's not perfect. The rest of the episode is even more problematic. First of all, Flash Sideways. This is all bullshit. I don't even know if I need to go into any detail. I don't care. Locke wants to have this surgery done because he wants to let go. I don't care. And this is the bullshit where Rousseau shows up and she's like, oh, you're going to come with us, Dr. Linus, even if I have to kidnap you. Like, nobody talks like that. And then they're setting up a situation where she's going to fall in love. She's going to have a romance with Ben, so Ben will raise Alex just like he did before because she needs a father figure. Fuck the Flash Sideways. I don't care. That character's not Ben. That character's not Alex. That character's not Rousseau. I don't care. I don't care. Oh, and Ana Lucia pops up. It's another member berries. Ooh, remember Ana Lucia? Oh. And then Hurley's like, oh, is she coming too? And Desmond's like, nah, she's not ready yet. And I'll get more into this whole who gets to go to the church and who doesn't thing when I get to the finale. But that's all a bunch of hooey as well. It's all a bunch of bullshit. And then they had, they're in prison, and Desmond says, I'm going to break you out, and blah, 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 blah. This is painful to watch. This is really painful. I can't stand these Flash sideways. Anyway, what was also terrible about this episode is the whole Ben storyline with Widmore. Blood is boiling. Okay, so first of all, back in Everybody Loves Hugo, which I believe was episode 12, Ben and Miles and Richard Alpert split up, and they were going to go to the barracks to get the C4. So during that time, Jack and Hurley and everyone else went to Knotlock. They went to his camp. They joined his camp. They got threatened by Widmore, who threw missiles at them. Then they split up. They went onto a boat. They sailed to Hydra Island. They got imprisoned by Widmore, who put them in cages. Then Knotlock showed up, which is at night, and then it lasted until the next day. So several days has passed. Knotlock shows up, frees them, becomes a smoke monster, frees them from the cages, puts them on the submarine. The submarine explodes, which is at night again, so another day has passed. And then the next day, Jack and Sawyer are stranded on Hydra Island, did they land on Hydra Island or did they land on the mainland? I can't remember. But anyway, they had to find their way back to the mainland. They had to walk through the jungle. Now, during all of that time, where clearly at least 4 or 5 days have passed, Richard Alpert, Ben, and Miles finally arrive at the barracks. What the fuck took them so long? This is ridiculous, and don't tell me that this is out of sequence and actually showing us an earlier time, because we see not much time actually pass to where they meet up with the other team, and Knotlock, of course, shows up, and it's really implied he's returning from Hydra Island, so it's proven that this is not just out of sequence. It's proven that this is happening at the same time that the other events in this episode is happening. So why the fuck? I think it's pretty much established that the Black Rock is not that far from the barracks. Certainly not 6 days walk. So what the fuck were they doing? And especially the dudes went from across the island, they went from Hydra Island, back from Hydra Island, they did all these adventures and all this shit, and all this time they finally get to the barracks. Anyway, that's only the beginning of my issues with this storyline, by the way. So, next, Knotlock shows up, or the Smoke Monster shows up, and they're scared because Whitmore's there, and Whitmore's like, okay, I'm going to go hide with Chloe in the closet, and Ben's like, okay, good luck. It's kind of like, I'm reminded of the Deep Space Nine episode, The Magnificent Ferengi, which is one of my favorite Deep Space Nine episodes, where it's played for laughs because they're stranded on the station and Jim Hadar had them surrounded and they lost their only bargaining chip. So they know that if they find out that Jim Hadar are going to kill them, and the Ferengi, and they're all goofy, and then one says, "Oh, what if we run? Maybe we can do this." And another Ferengi says, "Oh, if we hide, maybe they won't find us." And another Ferengi says, "Oh, well, if we surrender, maybe they won't kill us." And so they're each bringing up all the different options of being a coward. And it seems like I'm reminded of that episode in this scene because it seems like that same thing plays out. Because Alpert's like, "Oh, let me try to negotiate and surrender to the Smoke Monster," and Widmore's like, "No, let me try to hide from the Smoke Monster," and Miles is like, "No, let me run from the Smoke Monster," and Ben's just like, I don't give a fuck. I'll just hang here and do whatever." And so we have the whole spectrum, which it's so goofy. It's so cheesy. But anyway, so, speaking of cheesy, the Smoke Monster comes up, and Richard Alpert's like, "Oh, he wants me. It's me he wants." So he goes out, and the Smoke Monster just charges right past him, and he just goes flying up in the air, and they play it for laughs. That's so dumb. That is so goofy. I mean, for a while we didn't even know if Richard Alpert was actually alive until the next episode aired. So we thought maybe they killed him and they did it in this goofy comedic way, which would have been such a shitty way to make that to treat that character, who had this epic episode earlier in the season. And just like, oh, he just flies in the air. Isn't that funny? Okay. So then Nightlock goes to Ben and he's like, oh, do you know where Widmore is? And he's like, yeah, he's hiding in my closet. Why is Ben giving out Widmore? Why is he working for Nightlock all of a sudden? And then Widmore comes out and so Nightlock just kills Chloe. Why did this character even exist in the first place? They're just going to kill her like this. And then goes to Widmore and says, look, tell me what your plan is, or what what you're gonna do with Desmond and everything, or else I'm gonna kill your daughter. And so Widmore does tell him. Ben tries to kill Widmore before he can tell him, but he's too late. Why does Widmore tell Nightlock? Because he's threatening to kill his daughter. Hey, guess what? If he leaves the island, or if he destroys the island, which Widmore is giving him the key to destroying the island, his daughter's going to die anyway. So is everyone else. So is the entire world. So, but if he doesn't tell Nightlock, there's a possibility that Jack and the others may be able to stop him and his daughter will live. So there's your options. Either you have this possibility you could save your daughter, or you have a possibility, the other two possibilities, your daughter's dead. And one of those two other possibilities, everyone else also dies. So it seems like you're going to want to take the possibility where there's a chance your daughter's going to live. And that even if she doesn't live, everyone else will. You're definitely not going to take the option where the whole fucking world dies. This makes zero sense. And why the fuck are they killing off Widmore? It makes this whole character pointless. Like, what's the point of him? This is such a cheap... This is like the Dogon treatment. This is the Lana treatment. Like, this whole season cannot help but especially Widmore. He's this epic villain who was like so good in season 4, so powerful. Like, the whole threat is like, oh, I'm gonna kill your daughter. He's sending freighters, people, mercenaries to kill everyone, and they just kill him off here in this pathetic scene. And also, Ben kills him. What about the fucking rules? What about these rules? This is what I'm saying. I keep saying over and over again, fantasy, you establish your rules. And this, literally, like, it even spelled it out to the audience. They called them rules that Ben and Widmore can't kill each other. Now, again, we don't know why. There's fantastic elements involved, but in fantasy, as long as you establish your rules, and it's established, Ben cannot kill Widmore, and you stick to them. All of a sudden, like the whole time, like when Ben shows up at Widmore's house in the middle of the night in season 4, Widmore's like, are you going to kill me? And he's like, well, I can't do that. Even after he supposedly broke the rules to kill Alex, he still knew that there was rules in place preventing him from killing him. And Widmore couldn't kill Ben because of the rule. What the fuck happened to the rule? Why can Ben... Oh my god! Fuck the show! It makes no sense. So this episode is pretty terrible, is what I'm saying. Even though I kind of liked some of the aspects of the Jacob scene, but even some aspects also angered me. So this is not a good episode. This penultimate episode is actually quite bad. So... Okay, so let's get into it. Let's get into the end. The final episode of the show Lost, which is called The End. Kind of a unimaginative name, I think. But anyway, this is a 2.5 hour episode. It was aired as one episode, so I don't think there's anything that tries to divide it into two. Like a lot of other episodes that try to divide into two that aired as one episode. This one they don't. Flat out is just one episode. Anyway, so watching this episode again, because what I thought about this episode, and I've often said, is that I actually like the island storyline of this episode, and I pretty much stand by that. I think the island storyline was actually quite strong, to be honest. In fact, like, even though I will still say this is probably one of the worst finales ever, just because of how it didn't really resolve anything of the show, and how horrible the Flash Sideways were. When I did like my top 10 favorite finales of all time, this actually made it. But that probably speaks more to the fact, I think this is like number 7, and I think that speaks more to the fact that there's actually not that many good finales. Or at least there wasn't when I made this video, which was 4 years ago. There's been some good finales since then, but most shows actually don't know how to land their ending. That is the sad truth. Anyway, watching this episode again, I realized that the Flash Sideways takes up the majority of the episode, or at the very least half. It felt like the majority. Now, mind you, these Flash Sideways scenes might have just felt longer to me just because I really didn't want to watch them. It was torture watching the Flash Sideways. In fact, I will go as far as to say that the Flash Sideways scenes in this episode are worse than any of the other previous Flash Sideways scenes, because this is when they had the big reveal. Oh, God damn it. That it was, this is all just an afterlife. You know, while season 6 was airing, actually, as I said in previous videos, I didn't have an issue with the Flash Sideways at first. And everyone was bitching and moaning about them. I was like, yeah, they're not, I think these could be good. They're not that bad. But Damon Lindelof and Carlton Cuse, particularly Lindelof, kept repeating over and over again, look, you trust me. Just go with me. You're going to like the explanation for the Flash Sideways. They're going to be good. It's going to be good. It's going to pay off. Don't you worry. And so I was like, all right. You know, you created like 5 amazing seasons, or at least 4.5 amazing seasons of this show. You've earned my trust. I will trust you. And I trusted him, and he lost my trust. Because he's totally wrong. The ending that he's like, oh, hold up, this ending's going to make the Flash Sideways great. Actually did the exact opposite. This is like, are you serious? This is the ending that was supposed to justify the Flash Sideways? This very clearly made it like a billion times worse. Is some afterlife? Now, for those who haven't been watching my spoiler sections of my previous videos, in my spoiler sections I talked about how this doesn't match up. Particularly in like my earlier videos on season 6, that the earlier displays of the Flash Sideways, there are strong hints that it is not an afterlife, that it is in fact an alternate reality. And the statue underwater is the biggest example of this, because if we're meant to believe in this episode this is just some fake afterlife that those who survived the island, who were on the island, created so they could be with each other again, which implies that it doesn't really exist outside of their perspective. Yet, in the pilot episode of the season, or I should say the premiere episode of the season, you saw outside of any character's perspective to go underwater to see that the island was sunken. And so if this was some purgatory, afterlife that only existed in the perspective of the characters, then that just wouldn't be able to happen. We wouldn't be able. That contradicts it. And there's other things such as the whole "it works." Well, I guess I'll talk about the "it works" because in this episode, we see in the Flash Sideways, Juliet meets Sawyer, and Sawyer's trying to get the vending machine to work, and she does this little trick, and she says, "Oh, it works," and then she says, "Oh, we should get coffee sometime." And he's like, "Oh, I spent my last dollar on the machine. Maybe we could go Dutch." And this, of course, is what Juliet says to Sawyer in the first episode of the season shortly before she dies. In fact, they even show this scene a glimpse of that scene where she says this to Sawyer before she dies. They intermix it with here just to show, ha! We planned this all along, see? And ironically, to prove that it's consistent. But I argue that it's not consistent, that because Juliet does not say it works. So what we're meant to imply in the scene is that when she says it works, she's talking about this vending machine. It's just a callback to this scene, just like her lines about going Dutch. Issue with that is, she doesn't say it works. She says, I have something really, really important to tell you. And then she dies. And then later, Sawyer wants to figure out what this important thing is. So he gets Miles to use his talking to the dead abilities, and he figures out what she was going to say was, it works. So, Juliet's really important thing that she really, really needs to tell him is the vending machine works. Come on. No, it's not. If the really, really important thing she needed to tell him is that there's this cool afterlife where they'll meet later, so he shouldn't fret because they'll be together again, then that's what she should fucking say. She would say that. Hey, she would say, Miles would read her mind, and she's like, she says there's this cool afterlife, then you'll be together again. Or if you want to be vague, if you don't want to give away the flesh sideways, you could just say, Miles could say something like, oh, she says that she'll be with you again. See, that's vague enough. But to say it worked, clearly, very clearly, in the context of the first episode of the season, implied that the atomic bomb worked and created this alternate reality where the plane never crashed. And I already went into so much detail in my spoiler section of this previous video. I'm sick of talking about it. But that actually makes sense in words of time travel logic, that by setting up this atomic blast, it would create a second, like it's a whole type 3 time travel, where if you change something in the past, instead of it being like Back to the Future, you change the only timeline, and that like Sawyer and Jack and all were expecting to just disappear and be like Back to the Future and find themselves back in LAX, but that's not how it works. How it would work is that it would be like Star Trek 2009 or whatever, where it create an alternate reality, so you have two realities that exist side by side, one where the plane never crashed, one where it did. And that makes logical time travel sense, and I'm damn certain that that's what they intended to do originally. And this is also later evidence all the way up to episode 12, where the Desmond episode, where Faraday's talking about how he believes that they set off this hydrogen bomb, and it did create the reality that they're living. He says it outright. So I'm of the very strong mind that it was their original intention. In fact, when I first saw this episode, I believed, and I came up with this theory to justify what we've revealed in this later episode, that they did in fact create an alternate timeline, and you have two timelines side by side. And what Desmond is doing by awakening people is getting the spirits, or whatever you want to call them, of the people who died in the other timeline to reconnect with each other in this alternate timeline. So in my theory, when they go to the church, those spirits move on to the afterlife together, but then the bodies are re-inhabited by the original inhabitants of this timeline, so they just think, oh, what the fuck are we doing sitting in this church, and they go back to their normal lives. That's a very flimsy theory, I will admit, and I don't think it really has much merit. I'll tell you though, when I first watched this episode, I was trying so hard to believe this theory. I wanted to believe it, but the more that people were knocking this theory down, the more it made me hate this episode. The reason why I wanted so desperately to believe this theory is because I wanted to like the episode. And I'm like, but you don't understand. The more you convince me that this theory is wrong, the more you convince me that this episode sucks. Because it makes no fucking sense for it to just be some magical afterlife. Because here's the thing, Christian Shepherd at the end says, you guys created this place to be together. And that makes sense in the context of the atomic bomb. You created this alternate reality so you could be together again. But without that, what, they just magically conjured this? Again, this is getting back to fantasy rules. You have to establish rules and stick to them. In this case, nothing, absolutely nothing. There's no established rules that they can magically conjure an afterlife or purgatory to meet each other. There's nothing, absolutely zero establishment. It just comes out of nowhere, and I don't buy it. But then again, there's a lot in this episode that does suggest that this is just some magical afterlife that they just conjured out of nowhere, such as when Locke says to Jack, "You don't have a son." So this plainly implies that the sun doesn't really exist, that it's just not real. So then who in this afterlife is real? That's the question. It's not just the people that go into church, because Desmond says that Aunt Lucia's not ready to go, so that means she's real. And then Ben, they're talking to Ben like he's real, and he says that he wants to stay with Alex and Rousseau, so are they real? And fucking what's her face? Eloise Hawkins, she's obviously real because she knows what the deal is. And she wants to stay with her son, who's obviously real. You notice how when Charlotte and Daniel Faraday met each other again, there wasn't the magical doo-doo-doo, like, awakening that we see when the other characters meet each other, is because they didn't go into the church. So that brings up the question, what's real, what's not, and I think that this is a haphazard storyline that they made up halfway through the season because people didn't like the Flash Sideways, that they originally intended to be an alternate timeline, but they could see people were unhappy with it. But they're like, oh, fans really like this purgatory theory that was been around since the first season, where they thought that when the plane crashed, everyone died, and what's been happening on the show is purgatory. They like that theory, so why don't we make this Flash Sideways purgatory, because that will make the fans happy. I really think that's what happened, that they just changed course halfway through, and when Lindelof was saying, oh, you'll be happy, it's because he was thinking that's what the fans wanted, because they changed their mind, because they could see how much everyone hated the Flash Sideways. It's like, no, we changed your minds, we changed it to be something that's going to make you happy, because we're going to appease you, fan service, and make up this fan theory, which that fan theory sucked, by the way. I've heard a lot of people say that they thought that the show was originally meant to be that, but then everyone figured it out, so they changed directions and say, no, the show's not that the plane crashed, everyone died, and they were purgatory sometimes. I think that's total horseshit. I think there's no fucking way. I think the people who think that are really up themselves. That is definitely not what they were thinking. And when a fan theory first came about, they did their best to thwart that. It's like, that's stupid because it's a cheat. It's like we're in the snow globe the whole time. Oh, they were dead the whole time. That's a stupid theory. And the whole entire time as the show was airing, whenever people bring up a theory, I'd be like, that theory's stupid. It's definitely not the case. And it would be stupid if it was the case. It would be bad writing. And so they made it, well, they didn't make it the case, but they incorporated that into this Flash Sideways things. Now, regardless of whether or not my theory is true, that they changed course halfway through the season, or if they always planned it to be a purgatory, it doesn't matter. They still appeased fan service, appeased this stupid theory by by making this some sort of afterlife. Now, let's talk about who goes to the church, because this is something that's been a huge debate. Also, actually, before I get into the who goes to the church, I want to talk about the episode itself and how the Flash Sideways, which take up, as I said, the majority of the episode, or at the very least half, is just characters meeting each other, and they have this cheesy montage. They use the Oceanic 6 music, by the way, which is awesome, beautiful music, which is used so well in season 4 and 5, and they've ruined it in this episode to make it sound like a cheesy soap opera love boat melodrama bullshit, where every time two characters fall in love, or that love each other in the island, meet, and they remember the afterlife, they get these flashes, and talked about before how a lot of seasons finales, a lot of series finales, a lot of final episodes of shows, for some reason think it's a good idea to show clips, to make it a clip show. I think like Seinfeld did this, Beavis and Butthead did this. There's actually a lot of final episodes of shows that do this, but clip shows suck. Everyone hates clip shows, so why would you do this? And the answer to that is that it's a cheat. It's an easy way to honor the show that came before without being creative about it. Like All Good Things, the final episode of Star Trek Next Generation was very creative about it because it didn't show clips. It actually filmed new scenes, but that took place during the events of the pilot episode. That was amazing. That was being creative with it. Clips is now, to the lost credit, it wasn't a total clip episode. Like the clips only took off like a short montage. It was actually very reminiscent of the Deep Space Nine finale, which also did this thing which I hated, where they had a lounge singing hologram, and they would have like montages of each character remembering their time on the show, so they'd show clips while this stupid lounge singer hologram sings Frank Sinatra song, which is, I think that made that finale a lot worse. The finale would have been way better without it, by the way. And so this kind of reminds me of it here, but it's actually does make the show worse or the episode worse, because it's not just a cheesy montage. It's the whole entire storyline, Flash Sideways storyline, is dependent on this cheesy montage of, we're remembering, we're awakening. And it's just really, I don't know, call me cynical, but I don't really believe in soulmates, I guess is the word. And it seems like this episode is really pushing the narrative of the soulmates, one true soulmates, and they're obviously whoever was on the island with, even if they only were in love with them for like a couple days, like Saeed and Shannon, where the entire show has made it clear repeatedly that Saeed's soulmate is Nadia. The love of his life is Nadia. He says this repeatedly. But earlier in the season, we get to Flash Sideways. Nadia is married to his brother as a way to say, nah, she's not really his soulmate. It's Shannon! This girl that they had zero chemistry, and they were like slept together for like a couple days, and they're soulmates now. And so it was so cheesy how every single character paired off. Except for Locke and Boone, because poor Locke and Boone. Like, Locke's soulmate, of course, was Helen, but, she wasn't on the island, so she's not invited to the church. Screw her. And Boone, well, who cares? He's a bit of a loser anyway, so who cares about him? And so, I think, Jack and Kate, that solves the love triangle, because Sawyer has Juliet, of course, and, Rose and Bernard, I mean, that's actually makes sense because they've been married for a long time. And then there's Desmond and Penny, which also makes sense. They've been established as a really power couple. But then you got Saeed and Shannon. And then you got Hurley and Libby. Like, they didn't even go on a date together before. But no, they're soulmates. And God, who else do you have? Like, everyone's just paired off and like very cheesy. It was so cheesy. And just the way they were all like hugging and dancing in the church. It's just Charlie and Claire, of course. And Claire gave birth to Aaron. So this is an afterlife. And Claire gave birth to a baby in the afterlife. So is that actually Aaron, or is that just pretend? Does Aaron actually go with them together because she's holding him as a baby? And if so, what kind of hell, what did Aaron do to deserve to go to the afterlife as a baby? I mean, he probably lived his own life. He grew up, became an adult. Maybe he married. Maybe he had his own kids. Maybe he grew old. Maybe he became a grandfather. Maybe he had like 10 grandchildren. But So he's this old withered man who has like 3 daughters, 2 sons, and they all each have like children of their own. So he has like 20 grandkids, and all going around him going, "Grandpa, Grandpa." But then he dies, and he comes back as a fucking baby, and then he moves to the afterlife, and he's just a crying baby. Like, that makes no sense. I'm sorry. This whole concept is just so ill-conceived. It's not just the fact that we don't get answers to any of the mysteries. It's not just the fact that this is a huge aside, doesn't have anything to do with the main thrust of the show. It's not just the fact that this is cheesy melodrama that's depending on, "Oh, you're my soulmates." It's not just the fact that it's actually a bit spiritual or religious in the show that wasn't arguably not that much. So, it's not just all those things. It's the fact that this doesn't actually make any sense, even forgetting everything else about why these fly sideways don't work. It doesn't actually make sense in the context of the thing that they would create this purgatory and then they all meet up and the island was the only important thing to them. So I guess, well, I don't know what Jack's father gets to get there because his dead body was on the island that counts, I guess. But Jack's mother, who cares about her? Fuck her. Claire's mother, no, who cares about her? She doesn't fucking matter. What about Boone's father? He was quite, or Shannon's father, sorry. She quite loved him. He died too soon, but, as long as she gets to be with this dude that she was with for like a couple weeks, that's all that matters, I guess. So what about Charlie's brother? Does he not give a fuck about him? Like, no, because it's only the time on the island that mattered. This is bullshit. I'm sorry, but the object of this whole thing is to say that the people, and this is what Lindelof and other people involved with this show said, is to say that the time on the island was the most important thing for these people's lives. The people that they met, the characters that they met, the interactions that they had, that was the most important thing. They were fighting with each other for most of this time. And if they weren't fighting with each other, they were fighting others. They were fighting for their lives. People were constantly being killed. As I said, it was horrible. They were being kidnapped by these others. And then there's mercenaries come to just kill people. And there was a smoke monster going around killing people. It was not a lovely time. But it's the only thing that matters. It's the only thing that matters. Nothing else matters. This is a bullshit way to honor these characters. This is not all about the characters, as Lindelof constantly said. If you want to honor the characters, you would do it through the main storyline. You would show how these characters affect each other's lives and how important they are through an actual main storyline, not a fake fucking afterlife. The whole concept of a purgatory is a cheat. It's a lazy writing, and it actually doesn't honor these characters because they don't feel like the characters. As I said, we spent the entire season with these different versions of the same characters that and it is meaningless because none of it mattered. Jack doesn't have a son, as Locke said, so all the Sun and Jen not being married and having to sort of struggle to earn the relationship, or Sayid trying to save his brother's business, or Desmond trying to get Charlie to go to the concert and Charlie being really upset. None of that shit matters. It is all the entire half of the season is rendered useless with this scene because all of that is mind wiped. Like the whole storyline we got recently with Locke trying to get his legs fixed, and having the wedding with Helen. None of that matters because he's just abandoning Helen. Fuck it, I don't care about Helen because I'm going to afterlife with these people who I'm fighting with who tried to kill me on the island because that's all that mattered in my life. This is bullshit. I cannot stress that enough. This is a horrible, horrible, cheesy ending. And, of course, now, finally, let me get to who's at the church, because this is something that's largely debated. How come only certain people get invited? How come Ana Lucia wasn't invited? She's not ready yet. How come Ben's not ready yet? How come fucking Mr. Echo isn't there? It's because the actor didn't want to, they couldn't work out a deal. How come fucking Libby's there but Ana Lucia's not there? How come fucking Daniel Faraday wasn't invited? What's the deal? Now, I watched this video series from a YouTuber, I think called Rete, I believe you say that. It's a very popular series on Lost, which I really enjoyed. I watched it again recently. I don't agree with everything that he says. Some things in particular I pointed out, such as Jack's character story in Season 6 he hated, I actually loved. But I think he has a lot of valid critiques. And something he does that I think really works is that he takes clips of Damon Lindelof and Carlton Cuse in interviews and then to show them lying outright, and then shows the other clips that, and sometimes their own interviews contradict each other. And so that's what I love. It kind of proves that they're just bullshitting most of the time in these interviews. But anyway, one thing that he pointed out that I didn't notice, that I think is a very astute observation, is that the main point of the who gets to go to the church is all about reflecting season 1. Most of these characters, any main character in season 1 has an automatic invite. There are 2 exceptions, which I'll get to shortly. But then you have a few other characters who were beyond season 1, like Desmond and Penny. But Desmond, I would say, first of all, he's a fan favorite. They did a lot of polls to see who's your favorite character on Lost, and Desmond would either win or come second. So they had to include him. Plus, he was so integral to the Flash Sideways storyline. But he's you can kind of cheat that to say that he kind of was, implied in season 1, because season 1 was a whole storyline about the hatch, and he was the one in the hatch. But then you might be, what about characters like Bernard or Penny or Libby? But they, if they're in a relationship, if they're a loved one of a character in season 1, then they're good. Like Libby is with Hurley, so he counts, and Bernard is with Rose, and she was a season 1 character, and Penny's with Desmond, of course. And so either you're a season 1 character or you're a loved one of a season 1 character, like Juliet. She's the loved one of Sawyer, so she gets in. And I think that's definitely the case. I think because the whole season, and especially rewatching it again, I noticed throughout the season how much they try to call back to season 1. And that's often what before the season aired, they said this will honor season 1. This will bring the show back to the greatness that season 1 had. It totally does not, by the way. And by the way, I think season 2 is a better season of season 1. First of all. Secondly, season 1 was great because it really explored these characters that we didn't know, and it got them to meet each other. And this has a relevant Flash Sideways with a parallel universe that turns out to be an afterlife, with the characters we know and love living out different lives, and all is rendered meaningless when they just wake up in the lives that they had before that we spent half a season following mean nothing. So no, that doesn't fucking revive the greatness of season 1, but they were trying to do it through artificial means. Like, if I go back to On Island storyline with Not Locke, I talked about this a lot, that they had to make him Locke and wear the face of Locke. They even call him Locke. All the characters call him Locke. You know how every character has their theme music. If you notice, each character has a specific kind of theme music. It was something I loved about Lost. Locke has a specific kind of theme music, and they played it whenever they showed Not Locke, the smoke monster. Mostly it was like a twisted version. It was a bit more angsty, evil or whatever, to signify he was the villain, but it was still Locke's theme. But that's not fucking Locke! But they wanted, because season 1 was all about this feud between Jack and Locke, and a lot of people thought they presented Locke as a villain. I personally never thought that, but a lot of people thought the early season 1 presented Locke as a sort of antagonist, as a villain, so that's why they made him the villain of season 6, and that's why they had all the characters keep calling him Locke. Even in this episode where Jack has an epic fight with him, he yells, "Locke!" And I want to say, it's not fucking Locke! God damn it. But the reason why they do that is because they try so desperately to call back to season 1. So that's why they have Shannon fall in love with fucking Sayid. And that's why they have Boone show up, even though he was barely on the island before he fucking died. No one really cares about him. And that's why they didn't have other characters like Faraday or Lapidus or anyone else show up at the church. Or Ben didn't go in. Because they're not fucking season 1 characters or in love with the season 1 character. Now, the exception, of course, is Michael and Walt. I don't know why exactly that they wouldn't want Michael and Walt. I'm a bit weird with how they kind of avoided Walt. I don't know if they thought he was a bad actor, but I talked about this before, how in interviews in earlier seasons they didn't imply Walt would return because he couldn't be in the show because the actor aged older, but they were going to have a solution. And they did come up with a solution. They had a 3-year time jump that made it fit so the actor would appear the right age, but yet they didn't bring him back. And there's this epilogue, which I'll get to later, that brought him back, but for some reason they didn't want him in the finale. I don't know if they hated the actor or what. Now, Michael, they wanted to have the storyline that he was stuck on the island, that he's the Whispers, because he killed Ana Lucia and Libby. So he's not welcome in this cool purgatory afterlife, even though they specify in this purgatory, in this episode, that this purgatory afterlife thing is timeless. So it doesn't matter when anyone died. Like Boone died all the way years ago on the island. Jack died at the vents at the end of this episode. Kate and Sawyer, they could have lived to be old people, to a ripe old age for all we know. But they all come back at the same time and Hurley, he could have lived for centuries because he was fucking Jacob. But whenever they died, eventually, however long it took them, they all come back to this timeless afterlife where they're all the same age they were when the Oceanic 15 crashed. So how come Michael's not there then? Because the reason why they give is because, Michael did a bad thing, he's stuck on the island. Is he stuck there for eternity? Well, the new man in charge implies that Walt is on a mission to go back to the island to help his father. So I assume that means to help him pass. So why wasn't he allowed to go there eventually? And why didn't we see Walt at all? I still don't know that. So let me name some people we saw in this fake afterlife. We saw Kimi, we saw Mikhail, we saw Ethan, we saw Ana Lucia. And we saw Ben. So all these people get to go to this afterlife, but Michael doesn't. I'm sorry, but fucking Ben did a lot worse, killed a lot more people, did a lot more horrible things in his life than Michael did. Yeah, he gets to go. I mean, you could argue that, Ben, he served Hurley as a number 2, so he redeemed himself. Michael fucking gave his life. He gave his life to save everyone on the island. If it wasn't for him, everyone would have died. Everyone who was on that freighter would be dead if it wasn't for Michael. He gave his life to do that. So don't give me that bullshit. And for that matter, you might say, Ben and all of those didn't actually move on to the afterlife, so they didn't count. They weren't in the church. Sayid was. Sayid fucking killed shitloads of people. He fucking tried to kill a little boy. He fucking worked for Ben and would go around straight up murdering people. He was a fucking assassin. But he tortured people before that. But he's all good. He can go to the afterlife, but Michael can't because he killed Ana Lucia and Libby. Fuck that. This bullshit. This whole thing is a mess. It's a total fucking mess. That's what it is. I don't understand how anyone can like this. I think if people who like this, and I include myself because I tried to like this, believe me, I tried so hard when this episode first aired, but you're looking at it, and I was looking at it on a very surface level. And if you do look at it on a surface level, it can seem emotionally satisfying. Like, I must admit, I have to admit, when I watched this episode just now, I did get a bit teary-eyed with the Charlie and Claire reunion. I've always been a sucker for their relationship, so seeing them, like, fall in love again, I must admit it did make me a bit teary-eyed. But the issue is, when you look below the surface, if you use any sort of intellectual thought when it comes to this, you see that it's all empty, it's hollow, and that's never what Lost was. Lost was always an intellectual show. It was always a very cerebral show. There's been lots of academic articles written about how cerebral this show is, and that's why it succeeds on so many levels. Yet, this is the opposite of that. In fact, I remember a review always stuck with me that I read online that shortly after this episode came out that said this episode was very emotionally satisfying, but intellectually it was a letdown. Intellectually it was hollow. And that's it exactly. That explains this Fly Sideways ending to a T. It is a failure. It is not in keeping with Lost. It does not respect the characters. It just, the mantra of is all about this. Lost is all about the characters. First of all, that mantra is bullshit. Lost is a mixture of, it's just, and this is another thing that where the YouTube videos done by Rattay came in handy, because he went and got all these clips of Lindelof and other people involved with this show, specifically saying that this is a mystery show. Direct quote: "This is a mystery show." But in season 6, all of a sudden, they're saying, "No, it's all about the characters," and that was a bullshit excuse. They were saying that because they knew they didn't have an ending. They couldn't come up with a way to resolve these mysteries in a satisfying way. That they wanted to just fall back on doing fan service by falling back to stupid purgatory theory, which sucked to begin with. And so they kept saying it was all about the characters, when it absolutely never was. It was always about everything. It was about the characters. It was about mysteries. It was about the mythology. It was about the music. It was about everything. And I made this analogy before because J.J. Abrams in an interview once, and this bonus feature in season 4 DVD was said that the music in Lost is so powerful that without that music, Lost would not be the same show. And he's absolutely true. You need that music. That music made this show. And you can say the same thing about the character stories. The character stories were a very strong component of Lost. Lost, without these character stories, would be hollow, it would be empty. The character stories is why a lot of people tuned in because I constantly say that my favorite aspect of any TV show or movie is strong character stories. And that's probably one of the main reasons why I was so attracted to the show, because the character stories are so well developed, they're so interesting, they're so fascinating, they're so great. But it's not the only thing. There's so many, as I said, academic articles written about how this unique this show is, and none of it had anything to do with the characters. It was all about the mythology. It was all about the theorizing. It was all about the experience. They said it's like almost like an interactive show of fans constantly theorizing about the mysteries and how well they're developed. So to say that this show is all about the characters is just like saying the show is all about the music. Because just like Abrams said, the music is a very important component, but it was one out of many, one out of several components. If you take away everything else and it's just the music, then it's not Lost. Just like if you take away everything else and just the character stories, then it's not Lost. Lost is always a combination of all of these things, all of them. And to not honor them is why this fucking thing fell apart. And the Flash Sideways doesn't honor any of them, in my opinion, not even the character stories. But anyway, I gotta talk about this whole thing about a lot of the fan base, particularly when this episode first came out. A lot of people, more than it surprised me, like my own mother thought this, that the purgatory theory was true, that the plane crashed everyone died, and everything you've seen on this island since was purgatory. And a lot of people to this day will still think, particularly people who haven't watched the show all the way through, will think that is the ending, that this is a gimmick show, that they were dead the whole time. In fact, I had talked about before in other videos about how I had a lecture from a producer who actually worked in the film industry in New Zealand and created documentary films and stuff. And he did lectures at film schools about, analyzing certain films. And he talked about how Lost was a failure because it relied on the gimmick of they're all dead the whole time. And I'm just like, what? And I tried to talk to him after the lecture and tried to explain it to him, and he was just like, huh? And I was like, never mind. I kind of wish I did, showed him some videos or whatever. Say, go to YouTube, check out this video with interview with Lindelof. He explains it outright that he says it in plain language. Like, they make it clear in this episode itself. Like Christian Shepherd says, they weren't dead all the time. Everything that happened is real. Like they said it in the show. That's why I was so confused why so many people were confused by this and thought that they were dead the whole time, when very, very clear. I mean, there's so much throughout the entire show. Like, they keep leaving the island, they're coming back, more people come to the island, they leave. None of that fits with the theory that they were dead and this is purgatory the whole time. It just doesn't make any sense. I had no idea why so many people thought this was the case. And as I said, there's still people today, like this YouTube channel, very popular, million subscriber view channel called What Culture. They keep putting out videos where they keep saying that there was people they were dead the whole time and lost. And no matter how I scan their comment sections, just flooded with people trying to correct them. Like, no, that's not how Lost is. They keep saying this shit anyway. And it just shocks me. So there's so many people, and I've done, YouTube videos with other YouTubers who never watched Lost who would just assume that, and I would say, no, that is not the case. It's like a common perception. It's a misperception, and everyone attached to the show, all the writers, constantly, any producers, actors, everyone, constantly shoot this down, saying, no, that is not the case. But they are ignored. I remember I put a comment on the YouTube channel, or I think it was a What Culture, and I got one of my regular comments, maybe a solid comment through my channel, and the respondent was like, oh, you're trying to argue with me that they were dead the whole time. And the funny thing is most people who do try to argue with me will start by saying, I never liked this show. I never watched the show. Well, that's why you have this misconception, because you didn't fucking watch the show. You didn't pay attention to it. You just assume that they're dead the whole time. That's not a very strong basis to argue with someone. Like, well, I never really paid attention anyway. Well, there you go. You're wrong. I did pay attention. And anyone who paid any lick of attention to this finale, where Christian Shepherd clearly fucking said that everything that happened on the island was real, they didn't die. And clearly the fucking Flash sideways is the purgatory, not the whole entire fucking island. Very clear. It boggles my mind how so many people get this wrong. But, I mean, there was apparently, there's in the ending credits that show clips of footage of the wreckage of the plane crash. And it's empty. There's no one there. And Rattay talked about in his videos how he thought this was very misleading, and he can understand why people would see that footage and get the misconception that meant that they were dead the whole time, because you're supposed to showing you this footage of the plane and say that everyone was dead and this is the real life, whereas the purgatory was the rest of the show. And I disagree with Rattay. I don't think that's a natural conclusion. I didn't get that at all, because the producers of the show had to go right out and say and make an announcement, being like, no, that's just some footage we put to honor the original show, to pay homage to it, to have as a buffer between the news program, because you know how a lot of local news programs like to split the screen and put their stupid news thing coming up next on the news, which is so fucking annoying. So they put that footage there to stop them from doing that. And when the producer said this, I was like, duh. I mean, it was the most obvious thing in the world. Of course, it was just there to pay homage. Of course, it didn't mean anything. So I don't think it's a given. I think it's pretty fucking obvious that footage was just there to as a buffer to have over the credits to say, oh, look at this, pay homage, especially because, as I said, this episode and the entire season was loaded with so much fucking masturbating over the first season and paying homage. Oh, look at the first season, look at Shen, look at the first season, and Locke's the enemy, look at the first season. So it's so fucking obvious to me that this footage was just more of that, of course, and it didn't mean anything. But all that being said, it is kind of Lindelof, the producers, it's their fault that there is this misconception about the Purge and how much it upsets me. And I could go and rant about how stupid or how people are not paying attention, which I realize I shouldn't really do. Because as much as I do think they don't really know what they're talking about, it is the producer's fault that there is this common misconception, because they shouldn't have touched that purgatory theory at all. They touched it by incorporating it with the Flash sideways, which just confuses people. Of course, they should just leave it alone, not have any afterlife purgatory bullshit, because that was a stupid theory to begin with, and just totally leave it alone and don't go anywhere near it. That way you're not confusing anyone. So it's their own fault. But anyway, I haven't touched on the island storyline of this episode, so let me do that. Because as I said, I actually like the island storyline of this episode. And I didn't like the island storylines of a lot of episodes, particularly like Sundown. I hated fucking What They Died For. I thought had a horrible island storyline. But I actually liked the island storyline in this episode. Like a lot of people who like to shit on the finale would shit on the light, saying, oh, it came out of nowhere, and they think the scenes with Jack pulling the thing, the plug out of the thing, or Desmond pulling the plug was stupid and cheesy. I totally disagree. I think as I already gave my feelings on the light and how I think it fits with everything established in the show, and also I think the mythical feeling of this actually really works as well. I do love it, and I like that they actually go somewhere with the battle between Locke and Jack, and I think, as I said, it was very satisfying for me to see Jack have that faith in the island that Locke used to have. And in fact, when he said that he admits that Locke was actually right about most of the things, and I should have had more faith. I thought that was a great conclusion to Jack's storyline, and we get the final battle between Jack and not Locke, which he calls Locke, and it annoys me, but that battle itself was epic. It was great. At first I was thinking, is Lost really about these fight scenes? But when I think about it, every season has its epic fight scene. Like season 1 had Jack versus Ethan. I can't remember what season 2 had. Season 3, of course, had the big confrontation with the others and through the looking glass. And then Jack beats the shit out of Ben. Season 4 had Kimi versus Saeed, and Kimi was trying to kill everyone. So every season has their sort of epic fight scene. And this was intended to be the most epic of epics to top all of them. And I think they succeeded, quite frankly. I think the way this fight scene was shot, the scenery was amazing. The cinematography, how they had these helicopter shots, they had a lot of 360 shots. The music was extremely epic. It's one of my favorite pieces of music. And the tension in the scene was well earned. They did a good job establishing that everyone's life, like the whole world, was at stake here. The island was going to collapse, and if it did, that would be the end of the world. So everything about this fight scene works for me, and I think is absolutely amazing. So I do give this episode praise for that, and I do think it is the best fight scene. That definitely tops all of them. And I like how Kate is the one who kills, not Locke. And she even has a cool one-liner because earlier in the episode she shoots at him and he goes, "I'll save your bullets." But now when he's vulnerable, she shoots and kills him, and she's like, "I saved you a bullet." Like, that was awesome. That was great. And a lot of people, including Evangeline Lilly, who played Kate, complained a lot that Kate didn't really have much control, or wasn't much of her own person, or have much avenue of her own. She was usually just seen as the love interest. So I love how she wasn't. She had her own power. She was the one who killed the bad guy. Now, granted, Jack kicked him off the thing, but she was the one who actually gave him the fatal shot. And of course, Jack kicking him off the cliff was very reminiscent of the way Locke kicked Jacob into the fire. So again, it's a lot of circular montages that are meant to mirror events that happened earlier in the show, and I actually kind of like that, to be honest. And of course, the whole thing about the island falling apart around them while they're trying to get the plane on the air, like, that was very exciting. It had me really invested. And the ending where Jack sacrifices himself to save the island, and he gives Hurley that was touching. I do not feel a bit ashamed to admit I did shed some tears in that scene. That was a very powerful scene. I thought it was played so well, the way that Hurley was saying, "You can't die, Jack." Like, that did have me bawling. Like, that was really effective. I think that absolutely worked. Now, and the end, but this was beautiful symmetry. I've heard some people complain about this too, but I actually love this. I thought it was beautiful symmetry, the way that the ending mirrored the beginning of the show, because the beginning of the show, Jack wakes up. He's lying down. He wakes up. He gets up. Vincent runs away from him, and of course, a plane had just crashed. But this completely is like mirrors that. It does the opposite, because it's the same spot, the same bamboo field, which is why, of course, they put the light next to. They made a point of pointing out it was next to the bamboo field. So it makes a point of him. So he goes, instead of going to stand up, he goes to lie down. Instead of Vincent running away, Vincent comes towards him. Instead of a plane crashing, a plane takes off. Like everything's sort of the opposite. And of course, the big one is that the whole show opens on him opening his eyes, and here the whole show ends with him closing his eye. Like, that was beautiful symmetry. And the Lindelof did say that that image, they had this in their minds for a long, long time. Maybe since even towards the beginning of the show, they knew that's how they would end it, and I totally believe them. Because that is something, I think, a very simple thing that they could plan for, because it's not dependent on plot devices or anything. It's a very simple image, and I have no doubt that they kept it in their mind the whole time, and that's always what they intended to do. Problem with it is it intercut with that stupid church scene and that stupid flash sideways. I almost, I think one time I even did this. I did an edit where I edited out all of the flash sideways bullshit and just saw the scene on its own. I was like, that's much better. Although the music, of course, doesn't flow as much. But maybe I could have just redubbed the music. Maybe I should have done that. But anyway, one issue I did have, though, is in Across the Sea, we saw Jacob kick Man in Black's ass and chucked him down the waterfall. He fell in, and it came out the smoke monster. So he touched the light and became the smoke monster. So when Jack went into the thing and he touched the light, I thought he was going to become a smoke monster. I was like, oh no, Jack's going to be a smoke monster. But I don't know. They didn't stick to the rules, and instead he just died. Which, honestly, I think that would be stupid if he became a smoke monster. But if they were consistent with the rules, he would have. Whatever. So, I think I've talked about the end the much. So, I'm actually going to talk about the new man in charge, which is a 10-minute short I guess you would call it short or short film or whatever. It was a bonus feature on the season 6 DVD. If you haven't seen it and you don't want it spoiled, then go watch it first. If you don't have the DVD, I'm pretty sure you can find it online somewhere. So anyway, I mean, I kind of spoiled it throughout my reviews anyway, but anyway, this is what Lindelof was talking about. You know, Lindelof would say, "Oh, people who want answers, they just want a monkey to come out and give them all the answers and read off a list of answers." And when he says shit like that, he's completely. To me, it's proof that he's completely lost touch with his viewership and what his own fan base actually wanted. Nobody wants this, and has proof. And I have people argue with me. Oh, there's some people who want it. No, there's not. I mean, maybe one or two, but they're in such minority to be so insignificant. Nobody really wanted this, and has proof of my stance that nobody wanted this is that most people didn't like the new man in charge. And that proves me right, because the new man in charge was basically Lindelof's attempt to just chuck out a whole bunch of answers at us. And so it doesn't even come off as its own story. It's basically just an exposition dump. Like the first half is ridiculous, where it's about the people in Guam sending out all these Dahmer food packages, and Ben comes to shut them down, and they're like, "Oh, we don't understand what's the Dharma Initiative." So he shows them of the introduction of Hydra Island, and then Ben goes to the mental institution and recruits Walt, which absolutely has nothing to do with the first half. It's just it's not even a cohesive story. It's just an exposition dump. So, as for the first part of it with the Dharma Warehouse, so they're like chucking a bunch of answers at us. Some are sort of hidden, some are blatant. But basically, the main one is that the food drop in season 2, which was never answered, they said, "Well, this is your answer. There's these dudes who were kept dropping food because Dharma had been automated. Like, who's paying for all this food? Is that automated too? Like, this is a stupid answer. It doesn't make any fucking sense. Oh yeah, the thing was automated for 20 years, and they were in this warehouse, doing food drops on the island the whole time to no one." Come on, guys, you can do better than that. That's stupid. And then, the Hydra Island thing is explaining things, of course. Something that we already knew, like, that you could infer. It's just hitting it home that, the brainwashing thing in Room 23 and erase people's memory, so it perfectly explains what happened to Claire, why she couldn't remember where she was abducted, because they brainwashed her with Room 23, which is a pretty duh. And the polar bears, of course, a lot of people, to the day I still had someone say, "Oh, the mysteries make no sense because what the hell are polar bears?" Like, that was really well explained. But this thing explains it even more, if you weren't sure, that the reason they brought polar bears to the island is so they could experiment with electromagnetism, because polar bears are tolerant to electromagnetism. Also, they said they were taking the polar bears to the orchid, and we saw that the orchid has this little thing underneath where the frozen donkey wheel was, where it's actually quite cold, so they said this is kind of climate they're used to, so that's the environment they were putting the polar bears in. And that's also why we saw the polar bear in Tanzania, because that's where the exit is, so they obviously did some experiments that resulted in the polar bear being zapped away to Tanzania, so that all makes perfect sense. Actually didn't really need that explanation. But another thing that I think is true, and I had a couple people argue with me, but I think it's definitely true, is that when he mentioned, Pierre Chang mentioned that the not to take polar bears who are pregnant because electromagnetism has the ill effect on pregnancies. To me, that was the clear-cut answer to what was the issue, why all the pregnant women are dying on the others. Because, and if you notice the time frame for that, it all happened after the incident. So, because Ethan was born before the incident, and Juliet was worried, but his birth was fine. It's because of the electromagnetism that was released through the incident, and then when Desmond turned the failsafe key, he fixed it. So arguably anyone born after Desmond turned the failsafe key, or any pregnant women that got pregnant, would be fine. It was only during that period in between where there was too much electromagnetism that interfered with pregnancy, which they make clear in this thing. So, I mean, that's another. So, I totally think that's the case. Yeah. And, the Hurley bird pissed me off, though. They're saying, this is just some weird bird we're experimenting. So, that explains why the bird's so huge, but it doesn't explain why the fuck it's saying Hurley. It's trying to say in this episode it's not really saying Hurley because it kind of just goes, and it doesn't say Hurley. But in those previous episodes when that appeared, it definitely said Hurley. So that's some grade A bullshit right there. I'll just say that up front. And they talk about how the polar bears, they're not your friends, they're dangerous, to imply why they attack people before or whatever, which is, whatever. So this is all just an exposition dump, but it doesn't really have anything, it doesn't have any sort of creative story. So then we jump over to Ben going to Walt, and he's at the mental institution that Hurley was, even though he lived in New York, not Los Angeles or California, but whatever. And he's talking about how he should go back to the island and help his father. He's like, my father's dead. And he's like, doesn't mean you can't help him. And then he sees Hurley and he's like, I have a job for you. And they never really explain what this job is, so it's kind of left to the imagination. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that, first of all, they did mention his job was to help his father. Now, what else his job was, I don't know. Maybe he's supposed to become the new leader of the others. The new Ben, shall we say, since Hurley is more like Jacob's figure, which isn't exactly the leader of the others. Maybe Walt's the new Richard Alpert. I don't know. Maybe something along those lines. I don't know. But anyway, it's kind of, they're like, you've been wanting to die to know what happens, Walt. Well, here you go. We'll give you this 10-minute epilogue where half of it is spent on exposition dumping, trying to throw answers at you. And then the last 2 minutes or 3 minutes will show that Walt returns to the islands. You happy now? No! I'm not fucking happy now, because they should have had Walt be a part of the actual fucking show, not a 10-minute goddamn epilogue where he's only in like 3 minutes of it. This is bullshit. This is pandering. This is all just them trying to say, see, that's the answer. These are the answers. That's the answer. And even though I do agree that some of these answers fit, this is just, some of them, not all of them. Like the whole food drop thing is bullshit. But it's still, they should have found a way to integrate these into the actual story. Having a 10-minute epilogue that you can only find on a fucking DVD, not anywhere close to being good enough. Anyway, that's all I gotta say about season 6. So now, as I do with every other season, let me give my top 3 favorite episodes and my top 3 least favorite episodes of the season. So let me start with my least favorite episodes. So let me start with my number 3, which is Sundown, which I'm surprised this is only number 3. But this, as I said, this episode has so many flaws. Like, Dogon was completely out of character. The Saeed being evil makes no fucking sense. And the whole how come Dogon just lets himself be killed even though he knows he's the one holding back the smoke monster from attacking the temple, which actually doesn't line up with what's been established in the show. And also we get the stupid flash sideways where that says, Nadia is not really Saeed's love of life, so they can set up for this bullshit with Shannon. So this episode sucks. Number 2 worst episode of season 6 is Everybody Loves Hugo. This episode, they just fucking, mainly because they just killed off Alana. There's an amazing character, a lot of potential. We didn't know what we wanted to learn much about. They could have explored more of that backstory of Jacob, history, the island. But nah, fuck it, let's just blow her up. And they said, the island's done with her. Actually, the writers are done with her because they're too stupid to come up because they want to focus on this Flash Sideways nonsense. It's so stupid to come up with any actually interesting story where she has tons of potential. Let's just kill her off. And then we have Hurley acting completely out of character, like, oh, I know what the whispers are. Here they are. And everyone's just acting completely out of character, and then we get the stupid Flash Sideways. Like, oh, Libby shows up. Do you know Libby? She's just, and it's not really Libby. It's just, fuck this episode. Anyway, let me get into my number one worst episode of season 6, and that is The Last Recruit. Nothing good about this episode. This island storyline was just characters shuffling back and forth around the island, being, oh, you're here, now we're there, now you go there, or let's go here, you go there. It means nothing. It means nothing. And the Flash Sideways, of course, is Desmond going around, oh, I'm going to wake you up, I'm going to wake him up. Oh, here's Alana. It's all good that we just killed her off in this shitty way, because here she is in this Flash Sideways that we don't give a fuck about. No, this episode is horrible. No, yeah, so those are my 3 worst episodes of season 6. They might not line up to what you were thinking, but as I said, like, when I do my overall worst episodes of Lost as a whole, like, you might be surprised that not that many season 6 episodes make it, and there's some that I actually think are much worse than these. But that's because that doesn't mean I like season 6. I think season 6 as a whole is a failure. It's not so much you pin it down to any one episode. Not every episode was completely horrible, but just altogether, as I said, all the episodes get a 5 or lower, except for 2. So now I'll get into my best episodes of season 6, and I will only do a top 2, not a top 3, because as I said, there's only 2 good episodes in the season, because there's only 2 episodes not to feature the Flash Sideways, so by default they're the only 2 good episodes. Everything else is either average or shitty. So, second best episode of season 6, of course, is Across the Sea. I think this episode gets a lot more hate than it deserves. I think all the other Flash Sideways nonsense is way worse than this episode. The finale is way worse than this episode. And this is not where the show died. The show actually died in season 5 during Dharmavilles, when they said, oh, let's change the timeline, the variable. That's when the show died. Here, it was actually a really powerful character story. It helped explain sort of the setup of the island, and if you pay attention, it does fit a lot with what's been established, and it helps set the stage for how the ending will go. Best episode of the season, of course, is Ab Eternal. Amazing episode. This is what the whole season should have been like. This is an amazing love story, amazing flashbacks that really draw out the mythology while having a rich, strong character story. It makes you really relate with Richard Alpert. It was just epic in every way. The whole entire season should have been filled with episodes like this instead of Flash Sideways nonsense. Anyway, my rating for season 6 of Lost out of 10 is a 3. Very poor. In the past, I think I've given this season a 6 before. Sometimes I might have given it a 5. I think it was being too generous. I'm not quite ready to give it a 2 because there were aspects I did really like it has a Sid Jack's character story. The island storyline of the final finale I actually really loved, and I thought was a fitting ending for the show. It's just the fucking Flash Sideways nonsense interfered with it. Ab Eternal was an amazing episode. Across the Sea was very decent, and there are decent parts of other episodes, like the whole scene in the submarine where that was an epic scene with the bomb. Like, that was really intense. That was well done. So there's a lot of good parts throughout the season, but it's just bogged down in too much nonsense. The Flash Sideways are awful. It really does not respect what made the show great and why people watch the show. It really absolutely ignored it, and for cheap fan service and nonsensical, irrelevant storylines that do not respect the characters or anything about the show at all, which is the majority of the show. So I have to give it at least a 3, but I think the positives keep it from getting any lower. So that is it for my review of Season 6. Thank you so much for sitting through this extra long video and watching this video. But it's not, my coverage of Lost is not over. I will be back 2 weeks for the final installments of How I Would Write Lost, which I would highly recommend. Season 6 is going to be almost completely fan service. I think my version of Season 6 is what would have made the fans a lot happier than what we actually got in Season 6. But you come and watch, you judge for yourself. I could be totally wrong and just up myself, but we'll see. I will be releasing that in 2 parts because it's going to be so long otherwise, because I'm going to have to pretty much rewrite Season 6 from scratch. Pretty much. I mean, I'll keep some aspects of it. So if I did in one video, it would probably be like 3 or 4 hours long. So I'm splitting it up into 2 videos. And after that, I will return with my countdowns, my top 15 worst episodes of Lost, and my top 30 best episodes of Lost. So be sure to keep an eye out for that. Also check out my channel as I do many more videos on other shows like The Expanse, Star Trek, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.